All right, let's get started. Tonight is part 14 of our ongoing series on the fourth chapter of Bava Metzia. And we are going to be on pages 50b and 51a. And we are continuing with a question that we started working on last week, which was the question of, well, just to review our terminology, we have something called ona'ah, which the rabbis say is an overcharge or an undercharge of exactly 1/6 of whatever it is you were supposed to pay. And Rabbi Tarfon said it was a third, but whatever ona'ah is, at that level, there seems to be a choice that someone makes. That we'll see tonight a machloket about who makes the choice, whether either you can adjust the price, right, and whoever cheated the other person will give back some money until the price is where it's supposed to be, or you could just trade back and give the buyer back their money and the seller back their merchandise. If the price error was less than whatever we're calling ona'ah, then we said that the buyer or the seller, whoever it is that is losing out, is presumed to forgive a price error that's less than ona'ah. And last time we spent some time trying to figure out whether that forgiveness is automatic and immediate, or whether the person has a time period in which they could still come back and complain and we would fix it even at the forgiveness level. Above the level of ona'ah, we call the purchase a canceled purchase, right? It just doesn't work. And at that above the level of ona'ah, you're supposed to the seller is supposed to give back the money and the buyer is supposed to give back the merchandise, and you're supposed to start over again. And our question that we're dealing with is whether there's a time limit on coming and saying that the transaction should be canceled because the ona'ah was greater than, or the price error was more than ona'ah. Is that time limited, or can you come back forever? Can you come back 10 years later and say you charged me the wrong price, I want to trade back? And that is our question. Then we got distracted about something else. We never quite answered the question. Now we're coming back to answer the question. So that's what the word "my" means. What was the answer to the question we were talking about before? Tashma, come in here. Chazru l'divrei chachamim. So this is a quote from toward the end of our Mishnah. We had this sort of story about how Rabbi Tarfon disagreed with the rabbis about how much ona'ah is. He said ona'ah was a third. In Lod, which is the city where he seems to be the posek, and the merchants of Lod were very happy to hear that they were only going to be made to cancel transactions where the price error of at least a third. And they were delighted. Then he told them, but the return period, the rabbis had said the return period at exactly ona'ah was long enough for the customer to go and show the object they bought to a relative or another merchant to get an appraisal of whether they'd paid the right price. And Rabbi Tarfon said, no, that they have all day, not just long enough to go show it to somebody. And at that point, the merchants of Lod fired Rabbi Tarfon as their posek and went back to the position of the rabbis. So that's the part we just quoted. They went back to the words of the rabbis. So now we're trying to understand why they would have preferred. Remember, the rabbis have a lower standard for what it means to have a price error. They're going to describe a lot more things as canceled transactions because their standard is a sixth instead of a third. But they have a much shorter return period, just long enough to go show it to somebody rather than until the end of the day. Okay, so Iamart Bishlama Bitul Mikach Larabanan Bichdei Shir El Tagar Ulekrovo Rabbi Tarfon Kol Hayom. So if we say it correctly, if you interpret the mission in a way that makes sense, then you'll say that a canceled transaction, according to the rabbis, can only be returned for long enough to show it to a relative or another merchant. And that Rabbi Tarfon likewise would apply his standard return period to this, and he would say all day. Mishum hachi chazru. That's why they went back, because it's better for them to have more transactions potentially canceled, but have a much shorter time period in which for people to come back, than to have the uncertainty of having to wait all day to see whether their customers are going to complain, even if more customers will have legitimate complaints. Ella, Yamart bitul mikach. But if you say that bitul mikach, the canceled transaction, the Rabbanan le'olam choser, rabbis think you can return it forever. In that case, amai chazru. Why would the merchants want to go back to the rabbis? If everybody thinks that the canceled transaction can be complained about and reversed forever, then there's no reason to go back to the rabbis, because they've all got the rabbis. Rabbi Tarfon's having a longer return period than would really only affect that, exactly ona'ah amount. It's not going to affect the bigger price errors. And Rabbi Tarfon and the rabbis will be the same, basically, on the bigger price errors. And in fact, b'divrei Rabbi Tarfon nichelu tfei, they should be better off with Rabbi Tarfon, dekamashvi lehu ona'ah kol hayom v'tulo, because Rabbi Tarfon thinks that his category of ona'ah, which is limited by time, is bigger. He thinks that it's ona'ah that you can only return up until the end of the day, all the way up to a third of the price. So anything that's where the price error is between a sixth and a third, in this interpretation that we're about to say is wrong. But in this interpretation, anything between a sixth and a third, Rabbi Tarfon would say, well, you have to return it by the end of the day or you're out of luck. And the rabbis would say you could return it forever. So since that's probably a category in which they're going to make a lot of price errors, that's the category they were so happy about when Rabbi Tarfon changed the rules, it would seem that they would like to stay with Rabbi Tarfon instead of going to the rabbis. So that sort of proves that can't be the right interpretation, because they're not happy with Rabbi Tarfon. So, or it might be bitul mikach lo shchiach. It might be that really big price errors where the purchase would be canceled are just not that common, which would mean that they might be not that concerned about having a longer return period with the rabbis, as long as it gets them a shorter return period for the actual ona'ah, because the actual ona'ah is something that's more common. It's a little bit weak, because they seem that there were enough price errors between a sixth and a third that they were really happy when Rabbi Tarfon told them that those were not canceled. But apparently there aren't enough of them that they're really concerned when he tells them they can return, those can be, when the rabbis tell them those can be returned forever. So this is not the most compelling interpretation in the world, but because it's at least sort of possible to interpret it either way, we still haven't proved anything from the Mishnah. Okay, but we're still going to work on it. Amar Rava. So Rava said, Hilchata pachot mishtut nikne mikach. So Rava says the law is that at less than a sixth, the purchase is completed. Meaning we assume that whoever paid more or got less doesn't mind at less than a sixth, and you can't complain about it. Yoter al shtut bitul mekach. If the error is more than a sixth, that's canceled. Shtut kana umachzir ona. If it's exactly a sixth, then the purchase is completed, but you have to fix the price. And here's the important part, because we knew all of that already. And this, which sounds like it means all of the above, are only long enough to show it to a merchant or a relative. It sounds like we are going to limit you at the regular return period for any kind of complaint. And even if it was a very large overcharge, you cannot complain later. But we're going to modify that a little as we go along. Tanya Kavatei de Rava. So we have a Breita that supports Rava. Ona'a, pachot mishtut niknem mikach. So far, it sounds just like Rava. Ona'a is less than a sixth is a completed purchase. Yet, yater al shtut bitul mekach. If it's more than a sixth, it's a canceled purchase. Shtut kana umachzir ona'a diver b'natan. If it's a sixth exactly, then the purchase is completed, but you have to fix the price, according to Rabbi Natan. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi Omer, Yad Mocher al Ha'elyona. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says that the seller has the upper hand, which means that he's the one who gets to make the choice. Rodse Omer lo tainli mikchi o tainli masha initani. The seller gets to choose either give me back my merchandise or give me what you cheated me out of. So our Mishnah had said that it was the person who gets cheated who gets to choose. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi seems to think it's always the seller who gets to choose, whether you reverse the transaction or whether you fix the price. And both of them, all of them, apparently, according to both Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and Rabbi Natan, are just long enough to show it to a merchant or a relative. Okay, so that appears to be the end of this piece, because now we go back and quote more of the Mishnah. Except we're not really quite done with this. We've kind of provisionally answered the question that the for any kind of coming back and complaining, you can only do it as long as the return period, which for the rabbis will be long enough to show it to somebody, and for the for Rabbi Tarfon will be the rest of the day. But the rest of the Gemara is going to have some exceptions to that we haven't seen yet. Okay, so we're now quoting again from our Mishnah when it said, Ad matay mutar lachzir. For how long does he have the right to return it? Amar Rav Nachman, lo shanu ela lokech, ava mocher leolam chozer. Rav Nachman says, when we give a limit for the return period, that's only the buyer. Only the buyer is limited in how long he can return it. The seller can complain about the price and get his merchandise back forever. Right, so we live in a very different universe of buying things. In our universe, right now in the 21st century United States of America, we usually assume that stores will agree that the buyer is always right. And we assume that we can go back and complain, and a lot of merchants, if not all merchants, will do whatever they can to keep us happy, even a long time after we purchased. And by a long time, I mean longer than it would take to go home, show it to your family, and have them say, I can't believe you got cheated. Like the next day or a week later. But we would be, in our culture, quite horrified if, Target or Walmart or Kohl's could call you on the phone a month later and say, you didn't pay us nearly enough for that pair of shoes. We'd like our shoes back, please. Right? That's unimaginable in my universe. But it seems to be what we're saying is that the merchant has an unlimited right forever if they can prove that the price you paid wasn't fair. Yes, John.
I imagine there are objects which get used. And so it's a little bit unclear what returning them means a month or 10 years later.
Yes, I would imagine, for example, that you don't want your food back, even if it hasn't been eaten 10 years later, it definitely won't be in the same condition. I don't know how you prove that the price was wrong either when the object is not in its original condition, right? Like the bananas that I sold you were top quality grade A bananas, and you should have paid me more for them. too bad I can't show them to the judge because you ate them, right? Like, I'm not really sure how you prove anything in this arrangement, but we seem to be asserting that at least in theory, in principle, a merchant who can prove that you underpaid can get their money back forever, which makes the whole idea of things like sales or bargain hunting kind of ridiculous, right? I think that the buying and selling culture we're dealing with here is just so completely unlike ours that this is like taking a vacation in a foreign country where I don't understand anything, but I'll do my best anyway. Okay, so this is Rav Nachman's position, is that the deadline only applies to the buyer but not to the seller. So let's say that Rav Nachman, when he says that the limit only applies to the buyer and not to the seller, is helped by our story at the end of our Mishnah about Rabbi Tarfon, when the merchants of Lod go back to the rabbis instead of following Rabbi Tarfon. If you interpret this in a way that makes sense, then you will say, Mocher leolam choser, the seller can always go back. Mishum hachi chazru. That's why they were happy to go back to the words of the rabbis, because shortening the return period of the buyer didn't hurt them at all. They had a permanent return period. So of course they want to limit the return period of the buyer, because it doesn't limit them at all, and it limits the other person's rights. So that's presumably in their favor. Ella. But if you say that the seller is limited in the same way that the buyer is limited, then then why would they even care about the rabbis having a shorter return period for the buyer? Because the rabbis are making the same change for the seller. So if you shorten the return period, it benefits them that the buyer has less time to return it, but it also hurts them that they have less time to complain. As long as the buyer and the seller have the same return period, there shouldn't be an absolute preference for a longer return period or a shorter one. Unless Tagare Lod lo shchiach tau. It might be that the merchants of Lod are just really confident that they don't make mistakes very often. They almost never sell things for less than they're worth. They're really good at their job. They only sell things for more than they're worth. In which case, they'd like there to be a shorter return period for the other guy, and they're not concerned about their own need to return things because they don't think it's going to happen because they're confident that they're not going to make mistakes. Could be. Okay, now we have some stories. Ushbizichne de Rami Bar Chama, Zavin Chamra V'ta. So Rami Bar Chama's landlord, and this word that I translated as landlord also means host. I'm not 100% sure that Rami Bar Chama is in a paid landlord arrangement with this guy. He might actually be his guest, but one way or the other, Rami Bar Chama is living in this guy's house, and the guy sold a donkey, and he sold it for too low a price. He didn't get what he was supposed to get for his donkey. So Rami Bar Chama found this guy, and he was sad. Amar le, amay atzivat. So he says, why are you sad? Amar le, zveini chamra v'tai. He says, I sold my donkey, and I got the price wrong. Amar le, zil hadarbach. So Rami Bar Chama tells his host, he says, well, go take it back. Go undo the deal. Amar le, hashai li yoter michdei she'areh letagar lekrovi. So the host says, no, I have already waited longer than long enough to show it to a merchant or a relative. Shadrei l'kamei de Rav Nachman. So Rami Bar Chama knows that Rav Nachman has this position that the seller can always go back. And he says, well, you got to go talk to Rav Nachman because Rav Nachman can solve your problem. He sends him to Rav Nachman. Amar le, so Rav Nachman said to him, Lo shanu el lokeach v'mocher leolam choser. And Rav Nachman said to Rami Bar Chama, probably to Rami Bar Chama and the host, but okay, I probably should fix the translation there. That they only taught that about the buyer, the seller can go back forever. So in fact, Rami Bar Chama fixed his landlord's situation by sending him to talk to Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman ruled that he can get his donkey back and he can change the price. But now we need to know why. My Tama, why does Rav Nachman think that sellers should be treated differently than buyers? And they're not time limited. Lokeach mikcho biado. The big difference between the buyer and the seller is that after the sale, the buyer is holding the merchandise. So, kol hecha da azil machvile. Anywhere he goes, he can show the merchandise to somebody. Va'amrile itai lotai, and he can say to people, "Did I make a mistake? Right? Is this diamond ring really a $3,000 diamond ring? Right? That's an easier question to ask if you're actually holding the ring. Otherwise, it's very difficult to ask the question, even if you're talking to an expert. Mocher delo naket mikre biyade, but the seller who does not holding the merchandise in his hand, ad dimitrumele zvinte kizvinte, zvinta kizvinte, he has to wait until he happens to find merchandise just like his own merchandise that he sold. V'yada ita ilota. Then he can take the thing that he finds that looks just like his thing and show it to people and say, was this worth the price that I got for it? But that could take an arbitrarily long period of time. So, Rav Nachman felt it necessary to give the seller a lot longer. Okay, next story. Hahu Gavra, to have a Nakid Varshachi Lisbon. So there's this guy who's holding linen, maybe strips of linen, to sell. Karishita Vishavya Chamsha. He called out that he wanted to sell it for 6, while it is worth 5. It is not completely clear to me which part, where the quotation marks end, right? Where does he stop talking? And you'll see why in a second. Chamsha uplaga. And if they would give him 5.5, then have shakel, he would take it. Now it seems like his buyer knows that he'd be willing to take 5.5. So he may have said that part out loud. And if he said that part out loud, he may have said the real price out loud too. I am not sure how much of this he's actually saying out loud to the customers. In any case, so another guy comes and he says, he says, if I give him 5.5, 5.5 is an overpayment of only a 12th. So that's not gonna work. Well, or a 10th or an 11th, depending on exactly how we're calculating it, but it's less than a 6th. So if I do that, then no judge is going to listen to me. They're going to say, well, you overpaid on, that within the range that was considered normal. We presume that you're okay with that. No, you can't have your money back. So attain lo shita the atave ledina. So instead, I'm going to give him not the price he's willing to take, but the price he actually asked for. I'm going to give him the 6. Then I'm going to sue him, and I'm going to say he overcharged me. It'll be ona'ah, and the judge will say he has to fix the price back to what it's supposed to be, and I'll get, a whole coin back, and I'll have paid 5, which is what I was supposed to pay. Except it doesn't quite work that way, because Atala Kame to Rava. So he goes and sues him in Rava's court, and Amarle, Rava says to him, Lo shanu ela belokeach min hatagar. Sorry, but that law only works if you buy something from a merchant. But somebody who buys something from a regular householder, an ordinary person, has no complaint of ona'ah. So the guy he's trying to outsmart the merchant, and the result of his attempt to outsmart the merchant is that he actually ends up overpaying a lot more than he needed to get the merchandise, and it just loses the money. He doesn't get it back. Because we're now working on an idea that it's only professional merchants who have to charge fair prices. People who are selling their own personal stuff are somehow allowed to overcharge, which we'll be investigating that more as we go along. But that seems to be the assertion we're making here. So there's another guy, as far as I know, this is a totally new guy, who has nose rings that he wants to sell. Kari Shitin Vishave Chamshin. He calls out the price of 60 when they're really, in fact, only worth 50. And you can notice that there are, in fact, no units anywhere here. And that's okay, because it's the ratio between the correct price and the price that's being paid that matters. The units are really kind of beside the point, unless you actually want to go back in time and buy nose rings in ancient Babylonia. In which case, can I come with in your time machine? Because that sounds really cool. Anyway, so effectively the same case as before, except now it's nose rings instead of strips of silk, linen, sorry. And now we've multiplied the numbers by 10. So it's 60 and 50 instead of 6 and 5. So v'yahavu yahave lechamshin v'chamsha have a shakil. And this guy also would be willing to settle for 55. He would take it if somebody offered him 55, even though he's charging 60. Atahavu gavra v'amar. So another guy comes along and he says, if I give him 55, then I'm giving up the extra 5 coins because I will be presumed to have forgiven a relatively small overpayment. So etain lo shitin, I'm going to give him 60. And then I'm going to sue him and try to get him to pay me back 10, so that I will have paid the correct price. So you can already predict what's going to happen here. The case comes in front of Rav Chista. Rav Chista said to him, Lo shanu ela belokeach min tagar. That's only taught about people who buy things from merchants. Belokeach min bal habayit. But if you're buying something from a regular householder, ein lo alav ona, you don't have a claim of ona. And then Amrli Rav Dimi Yashar. So Rav Dimi said, Yashar koach, good job. Right, that you ruled that one correctly. And V'chein Amar Rabbi Elazar Yashar, and Rabbi Elazar also said Yashar koach. That's the right answer. We seem to have a consensus. There doesn't seem to be anybody here who thinks that people who are not professional merchants can be held responsible for selling things at the right price. And not, as we will see in a minute, because we don't think they don't know the right price, which certainly would be a possibility, but because we think that we'll see. But we taught in the Mishnah, Kishem she'ona'ah lehedyot kach ona'ah letagar. Our Mishnah said, or will say, I'm not actually sure, I don't think we've seen this Mishnah yet. I think it's the next Mishnah, or the one after that. In the same way as there's ona'ah for a regular person, likewise there is ona'ah for a merchant. That sounds a lot like we're not making a distinction between professional merchants and other people in the world of ona'ah. Man hedyot lav balabayit. So we say hedyot in the Mishnah, who is that? Isn't that just this same householder that we're talking about here? Amar Rav Chista b'tzadriyata. That's talking about it's talking about an ordinary householder, but it's talking about an ordinary householder who manufactures linen clothing as a sort of a sideline in his house, not for himself to wear or for herself to wear, but to sell. So although they're not a merchant in the sense that that's not this person's primary way of making money, it's not mostly what they do, but the stuff that they're selling is stuff that they manufactured in order to sell. It's not their own personal stuff that they've been using, and now out of desperation for cash, they're selling it to somebody else, even though they don't want to, right? Which seems to be the case that we're presuming is normal for regular people selling their stuff. This is we're now dividing things up. There's professional merchants, then there's regular people who sell stuff that they never intended to keep for themselves, but they don't do it that enough for us to call them a merchant. And then there's people selling their own private stuff that they were not previously planning to sell. And we're the first category and the second category have ona'ah, because those people, we presume, can be expected to be clear-eyed about the stuff, because the reason they own it is in order to sell it. They bought it or they manufactured it in order to sell it, as opposed to the third category. So Amar Avalmani Tashmishte, but somebody's own household furnishings, their own stuff that they've been using, diakiriale, which are very valuable to him or to her. Lo mizavin lahu ilav b'damayateri. You're not going to be willing to sell that stuff unless you can overcharge for it. And it seems like either we think that the economy depends on people sometimes being willing to sell stuff that they've been using at their home, or the people's financial well-being depends on them sometimes being willing to sell things that they have until now been using, but now they can't afford anymore, they need to get rid of and replace with money. And so we can't afford to make a rule that will make it impossible for people to sell their regular household furnishings. I mean, emotionally impossible, not legally impossible. And so we have exempted the people selling their own household stuff or their own clothing from ona'ah, because, well, either because we felt we needed to in order to make society function, like I just said, or possibly because everybody knows that people overvalue their own belongings, and so nobody really expects them to charge a fair price. And so anybody who enters into a negotiation with that person about price to begin with is sort of expecting to be cheated. So I don't know, our world of cheap manufacturing has made reselling your household goods almost always a losing prospect. You almost never get back as much as you originally paid for them, because we have just so much manufactured stuff in our society that everybody can just have new stuff all the time, and that considerably devalues used stuff. But I think we still have a similar phenomenon with houses or with apartments, where the person who currently lives in the house thinks that the color that they painted the kitchen is fabulous and definitely raises the value of the house. They think that the particular bathtub that they chose for the bathroom is wonderful and it definitely raises the value of the house. The style of the banisters that they chose, etc., etc., etc. Whereas the customers or the realtors or whoever look at this stuff and they just compare it to other people's houses. They don't have any emotional attachment to it, and they might think that it's valuable, or they might think that it's terrible, and they're going to rip it out as soon as they buy the house. And that's part of why people who are selling their own personal home often value their house at a lot more money than the people who might want to buy it, because the fact that you picked out those things means that you like them, right? So now imagine a world in which clothing and furniture and shoes and so on are just as difficult to manufacture as houses, and people don't have very much of them. So now the shoes that you carefully manufactured yourself and you've been wearing also look perfect to you. Likewise, the sweater that you knitted from the wool that you cut off your own sheep and then processed. So I think people get attached to their own stuff, and they value it much more highly than they value other people's stuff. And then if they have to sell it, they would like to be paid extra for it. Okay, that is what I have for this evening. I know it's not quite 8:45, but I guess I calculated wrong. Are there questions? Okay. Then I guess I will see all of you next Monday. Have a great night.
Thank you, Deborah.